And it is in the context of that of this increasingly globalized society, economy, that I'm particularly pleased to introduce this plenary session that speaks to the importance of deepening and extending our international linkages. This roundtable, featuring Homa Hoodfar, who is now a household name in Canada, as our special guest, but with an exciting and really incredibly good panel, places a lens on issues of freedom, freedom of inquiry, freedom of expression, freedom of association, all of those that are so important in our worlds of research, scholarship, and innovation. So at this point, let me turn to Ivan Semeniuk, who is almost equally well known to some of you, all of you, I'm sure, and if not, you should know Ivan well. Ivan, would you please come up, take the parole, and introduce the panel? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Whether or not you know me, you should know the Globe and Mail, and I just want to put the brand out there. My name is Ivan Semeniuk, and I'm the science reporter for the Globe and Mail, and it's been my pleasure for a number of years now, I think going back to 2009 now, covering this conference and watching it grow and having that experience of seeing the science policy community flourishing in Canada and filling this really much needed role of sort of being a third arm of the science conversation in Canada, with the other two arms sort of being the funders and the scientists who actually do the work. So our topic today is science and human rights, and I don't think I have to remind this group that the image of the scientist as political prisoner or the scholar at risk of detainment or under threat of suppression is an image that is as old as science itself. You may remember a fellow called Galileo. So it's right in the DNA of science that these incidents of imprisonment and suppression are part of the, at times can be part of the job. Of course, that's history. I think what's easy to overlook is that this is also part of our present. It's here in Canada a part of the present that, fortunately, many of us can, kind of regard from a distance. We have the luxury of thinking of it in an academic way, but of course, for many hundreds of scholars around the world, it is absolutely a terrifying part of their everyday reality. Janet mentioned yesterday's events. I'm going to only mention them obliquely in this way to say that whatever your opinion, we all, I'm sure, felt a little wave of uncertainty yesterday, a little wave of political uncertainty, maybe even a sense of risk, the kind of risk that comes when there's a shift, a kind of political change. That's a sort of experience from a distance, and it's a communal experience, but you have to take that little, whatever that emotion was, magnify it many, many orders of magnitude, make it much more personal, much more physical, much more immediate, and more menacing. And if you can amplify it that much, you might have a hint of what it might be like to be in the personal, individual position of being a scientist, a researcher, a scholar, facing immediate personal risk or threat from authorities of some kind. So it's appropriate for us here at this conference, at this policy conference, to regard this situation and this topic from a policy perspective, and especially from a Canadian perspective, because of our self-image of Canada as Canadians, a tolerant democratic society that has the potential to be a force for good in the world, or to have a positive impact on the world. So without further ado, I want to bring up our panel, starting with Irwin Cotler. Now, I'm biting my tongue here. I really want to say the Honorable Irwin Cotler, but he is, of course, a former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, but he is now Chairman of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights and Emeritus Professor of Law at McGill University, and of course, former Member of Parliament. Professor Cotler, Mr. Cotler, please join us. Also, I'm going to bring up Viviana Fernandez. She is the Assistant Director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa, where she's involved in the Canadian branch of the Scholars at Risk program. Ms. Fernandez, please come up. And finally, Dr. Homa Hoodfar, anthropologist, professor at Concordia University, and of course, a scholar who, until very recently, was imprisoned in Iran over 100 days, and to our great delight, is now back with us here in Canada. Please, Dr. Hoodfar, come and join us. Thank you. Oh, great, you can still hear me. So I'm moving now to the chair. We're now going to go to the comfy chairs. So, and make this a little bit more casual. But of course, we have all been reading about Dr. Hoodfar's release in September and the efforts that went into securing that release from the Iranian government. I wanted to start with you, Dr. Hoodfar. If you could sort of orient us, could you tell us a little bit about your research, about the kind of work you do, and how that might have played a role in your detainment and what happened?
Well, thank you for the invitation, and I'm glad to be here and not sitting in my little cell in Irwin prison. I actually, part of my research has been on women in Muslim context. I have worked not just in Iran, but I have worked in Egypt, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, Indonesia, and but of course my recent problem has occurred in Iran, since I was visiting Iran last February. For the first time, I had been there during election. It was a parliamentary election, and one of the issues of my research has been, in the past, has been reproductive rights, family law, reform in the Muslim context, but also Afghan refugees in Iran and in Pakistan, the Muslim community in Canada, but also in Britain. So these were general area of my research. However, I also have been working on, more recently with one of my PhD students, we had written a book called Electoral Politics, Making Gender Quota Work for Women. This book was published in 2011, and it actually examines the research on the debates on gender quota, whether it works, it doesn't work, where it had worked, and when it didn't, it has not worked. In this book, it was theoretical with 8 case studies. Iran doesn't even come to this book, not even as a footnote. And yet that was really the pretext of arresting me and raiding my apartment, because they couldn't understand why I have changed my topic, and they thought I was there to influence the election as part of the soft influencing the culture and changing women, so that changing Islamic Republic as a Islamic Republic state as it stands. Of course, it was very also complimentary that they thought single-handedly I can actually change the result of the election. And the fact that I had not even met a single candidate or talked to anyone or interviewed anyone at all in the official position, neither in this trip nor in many of my previous visit to Iran. So that was the pretext. But generally, although so academic freedom, of course, was a major issue that the discussion went there. For better or worse, I have to say that although I had been teaching human rights for over 15, 16 years, I have never actually myself preoccupied myself with academic freedom. Academic freedom, like I'm sure for many of us, is like a principle, in-house principle that many of us who are doing research and teaching accept it as a fact. and believe that it is essential for advancement of knowledge and producing knowledge and advancement of our global society, but also various community in which we live in. But regardless of this, academic freedom became an issue that I actually learned a little bit more and reflected on while I was being interrogated. I mean, the interrogation session I was subjected to was 45 times. Some session went from morning to night, like 9 hours, 10 hours with 1 hour for lunchtime. But in this process, several issues became important that I only refer to very briefly, and hopefully later, if there's interest, we can discuss them afterwards. But one of the issues that I was very surprised is the assumption that advancement of digital technology and its progress actually empowers civil society. Well, while I was detained, there I realized that actually in societies where democracy is too young or doesn't exist at all, this advancement of technology, while it may have empowered civil society, especially those on the margin to some extent, but it empowers the state much more. Like in the Iranian case, but I know also in Egypt, and I know in Syria. This Middle East is my area of research. Actually, digital technology is employed by the state to control the citizens, especially academics, journalists, public intellectuals, and even business people who do international business. So the state is very keen in controlling this. In Iran, they also own a lot of the internet companies there, so they have bought a lot of big like Telegram and other channels of information. So they are very proud of being part of this advancement. And when they were interrogating me, they actually very proudly announced that Iran is so advanced in this position, they have actually broken into Pentagon computer information. They have controlled Obama's computer for a couple of hours. They have controlled Chancellor Angela Merkel for a few hours. They know they can control the opposition citizen of Iran who are opposing Iran outside. And they have, of course, they had confiscated all my books and computer and Kindle, telephone and everything. And so from my phone, they could see who I have seen, whom I have talked to, and where I have gone. So they thought it was a sort of advancement. When I objected that, well, what about the private life of people? Because the Iranian constitution actually protects the right of people to freedom of expression. And they thought when it is state security, those are secondary factors, so it didn't count. But one of the other debates that I briefly mentioned here, that while human rights, whenever the issue of human rights rose in these long conversations that we had, they always said, we don't need internet human rights, we have Islamic human rights. We will, which is international human rights, is man-made and so is imperfect, but we have a human right that is God-given, therefore is much more relevant to our lives. And of course, they use that a lot, but this Islamic human rights, they now have got charters and it's subject to a lot of changes. But what was interesting was not that they used that as just like a few years ago, like 10 years ago, they would just dismiss a question of human rights, but today they're not dismissing human rights, but they are reframing it as an Islamic human rights. So they kind of pick and choose what rights they recognize and what they don't recognize. But when it came to the question of academic freedom, they were not actually, they were not very, it was as though they had never thought about it. They didn't, like they asked me, why have you changed who told you to change your subject of research? Why have you have moved from reproductive rights research to writing about women and politics? Well, the idea that I can choose my topic, or I said, well, no scholar, most scholars don't just do one topic in 30 years of research that they do. Or who funded this research and what do they want from you? When I mentioned that this was just me and my student decided to do this was a topic I was teaching and I have written, and in fact, I didn't have to report to anyone. The book is published in English, but it was kind of hard for them to accept that you actually can switch topic without anyone telling you, or activities that you do necessarily has to deliver something to someone. And of course, for them is that the West, that includes all the Western Hemisphere states, is after influencing Iran because they can't conquer Iran militarily. Now they are trying to change the culture. And me writing this book is part of that strategy. And the fact that I haven't mentioned Iran even in a footnote, they thought it was a clever way of actually talking about this. I said, no, I didn't put Iran because Iran, in the parliament, we have 9 women out of 300 MPs. I can't talk about gender quotas in this condition, but that was not acceptable. But nonetheless, they became quite interested in the debates in that. So even after my file was closed and sent to court, they would come and discuss this with me. And I realized that part of the problem maybe is on our part. We haven't ever tried to make academic freedom and importance of that for society as a public knowledge, and we have always treated it as an in-house. That includes myself as a human rights teacher, not focusing on that, accepting that as a fact. And also the other factor that it was very important in this various interrogation that I had was that the West has double standards. And you always, like they had example of how American and British, and they didn't have Canadian, but how they have arrested people and prevented from their research or put them in jail. But we only object to Iranian or Chinese or North Korea. North Korea was kept as a model of good state. That was quite interesting why that should be the model of the state for them. But nonetheless, they were interested in this discussion of double standards. And when I mentioned that no, it's not correct, we in fact do object to that, although because they had mentioned WikiLeaks and Snowden issues and how Americans spy on their citizens, and why are we objecting to the Iranian doing it, but not objecting to American? And I was discussing that it was part of almost an international debate on this, and everyone discusses, but they don't hear that side. So it was also a style of when we write on human rights issues or academic freedom, if we have to develop that the style that when we write we shouldn't write in such a way that like the West is perfect and only the Iranian or the Syrian or the Egyptian or the Chinese are at fault. So in fact, that's a style that in the human rights campaigns, human rights activists have developed that style to a large extent. And so I'm not surprised that at least now for the Iranian or the Egyptian and all this, or other countries, when they talk, they say, well, okay, we accept human rights, but it has to be a step by step. In the Iranian context, they say it's Islamic human rights. They don't deny that it is important. So maybe for academic freedom, especially now that with this uncertain situation, we should also think about not just treating it as an in-house or addressing each other, but also popularizing the idea, because when a scholar or a scientist is actually arrested and put in jail, the assumption in public, especially in outside the Western countries, is that they must have done something against the state. While if there is a novelist is put in jail, a lot of public support is there because those are issues that have been popularized. But for scientists have been not been really trying to reach out to popularize these issues along with freedom of expression. So one of the issues that I had been thinking, and a lot of the debates that I had with my team of interrogation, there were 9 of them, each a specialist in one field. But at any one time, I had 2 or 3 of them sitting and discussing with me or questioning me. I mean, that was not always discussion. A lot of it was shouting and screaming. But anyway, I treated that as a discussion. So on the whole, I actually started to reflect a lot about academic freedom and also thinking about how we can get around this question, particularly given the situation in the Middle East with Iran, Turkey, Egypt, Syria. All of these becomes quite important issues. Well, I think I stopped here.
You said something very interesting about scientists, novelists, sort of the way that difference is perceived, and I think that underscores a really interesting point that is worth drawing people's attention to, because I suspect that, I think for many people, when news comes on of, a political prisoner in some situation, there may be kind of a knee-jerk reflection, didn't that person realize that they were walking into a risky situation? But I mean, this happened to you this year, but you have been visiting Iran in this capacity since the early 90s. So how much of this was a surprise? Like, how much of it caught you completely off guard? You weren't boldly walking in looking for a confrontation.
No, actually, this year I had, in the past, sometime I had gone to Iran for research. This visit, I actually had applied for early retirement. This was my first year of being retired. And I thought I'd spend a few months traveling and organizing my bookshelves and all this. I have 3 half-finished books that I wanted to start finishing my books. But I spent my first year of retirement in Irwin prison. But anyway. But when I expected that, sometime I had heard like they would call people in and question and ask them what kind of research they do. So when they actually initially came and raided my apartment and took my personal belonging, I expected that they probably will interview me a few times and then let me go. But because especially what I had done, I mean, this book was published 5 years ago. It's not relevant to Iran. I had not visited anyone this trip. Especially, I was careful because it was election. I didn't want to go and see some friends who are not in some position. I didn't contact anyone. The only people I met was seven PhD students who work on various aspects of either city councils or women in politics, or issues that were in area of my research. So the conversation was all about methodology. It was nothing to do with politics. But because the election had not gone the way the conservative wanted to go, they were looking for excuses to blame this on others, especially outsiders, to say that they have influenced the result rather than accepting they have lost popularity. So I happened to be the one there who had, and then I'm not even sure if they knew much about my book. I had given one interview to a women's magazine on the issues and debates on women and politics worldwide. Then again, it wasn't really referred to Iran.
Right. And it seems like such a strange chain of connections, and yet it becomes this incredibly harrowing experience for you, and really a life-threatening experience for you. I think, Viviana, Fernandez, this would be an excellent time to bring you here, because we have this very vivid personal example, but of course, there are many hundreds of examples, and they vary. You know, of course, here we have a visiting scholar in Iran who was detained. There are other cases where there are scholars within their own country who are under some sort of political oppression of different kinds. Could you give us a sense of your work at the Human Rights Center, and and how you view kind of the larger landscape of this, the scope of the problem, how many people, how is it changing?
So my perspective comes from the point of view of the Scholars at Risk Network, and in particular their academic freedom monitoring project. And in that context, they have issued 2 reports, one in 2015 and the second edition a few weeks ago. And what they account for are 4 types of incidents. And so you have categories of killings, violence, and disappearances, wrongful imprisonments, wrongful prosecutions, loss of position, and threats to peaceful student expression. So those are 5 types of threats and incidents that they document. The project covered 2 periods of time, so between January 2011 and May 2015, and in that period of time, they were able to document 333 attacks.
Wow.
On 65 countries. And unfortunately, the second edition between May 2015 and September 2016, they documented 158 attacks. So across 35 countries. So obviously they are, they have a tremendous amount of variance in terms of the circumstances, and the reasons are usually specific to a particular researcher in a particular circumstance. But when you see really random acts of violence in campuses, attacks, bombing attacks in Afghanistan or Pakistan, people shooting in USA campuses, then you start seeing a pattern of violence in higher education communities that are quite worrisome. So,
are there factors that make scientists and scholars more at risk? You know, it's a kind of pursuit that has an international quality to it. You're interacting with colleagues. You know, is there something about the role that puts people in that risky situation?
I would say that the fact that academics have, because of the nature of their work, an international aspect most of the time, and there is a certain degree of prestige associated with the fact that they have possessors and creators of knowledge, and they can share that knowledge in different forums, and then publish and speak about it, makes them a target when positions conflict with priorities of the state or priorities of the powers that are controlling the situation. So that can trigger a lot of the problems.
Right.
But what the last report in particularly shows is that the geographic, where these attacks are happening is really widespread, and the rise in numbers is quite concerning, especially when you see attacks against students, and including some students who engage in violent acts within academic institutions. So that generates a climate of fear and a climate of insecurity where the pursuit of academic research is quite difficult to continue and foster.
And Irwin Cotler, I'd like to come to you too, because I know, I mean, you have a personal history in your concern for the plight of political prisoners that goes back 40 years now. I was hoping you could share with us some of the experiences that you've seen, but also what kind of patterns emerge, because I know there's great diversity, but in terms of trying to bring aid or resolve some of these cases, what kind of patterns do you see?
Yeah, there are a number of common patterns that one find in these different cases over time even. The first is what I would call the criminalization of innocence, where people are imprisoned not for anything they do, but for who they are or for who they are perceived as being. I mean, Homa is a classic case study of that situation. The second is what I call the criminalization of fundamental freedoms. And Janet mentioned freedom of expression, freedom of belief. This occurred with the first two scientists that I represented actually in the former Soviet Union at the time, Andrei Sakharov and Anatoly Sharansky. The third is what might be called torture in detention. Again, Homa experiences. And this is done for a variety of reasons. It is sometimes done to coerce a false and incriminating confession. It's also sometimes done to deter others, etc. But torture in detention is another experience one finds, and that now is occurring with regard to a prisoner that I'm representing right now, Raif Badawi, the imprisoned Saudi Arabian blogger who's both been imprisoned because of his exercise of fundamental freedoms as a blogger, and he's been tortured in detention through the administration of lashes in that regard. A fourth thing, and one finds this particularly in authoritarian regimes, is a systematic denial of due process through the sham trials and the appearance of a legal trial, but it's without representation by counsel, it's without an independent judiciary, it's with the false evidence being introduced, et cetera, et cetera. A fourth thing would be the suppression of civil societies or NGOs who come to their support, again as a means of deterring and sometimes then imprisoning some of the leaders of those civil society, along with imprisoning, let's say, the scholar or the academic or the dissident. A sixth would be the harassment of the families of the prisoners. This also is sometimes done to secure a false confession and for deterrence. And all this is part of what I would call a pattern of, particularly in the authoritarian regimes, of state-sanctioned, state-orchestrated repression. So the question then becomes, what can one do about it? And I think in terms of securing the release of political prisoners, I have found that it's really a combination of effective public advocacy and effective private diplomacy. I've developed a kind of 10-point advocacy model. I'm not going to burden you with it. Just give you one case study that I experienced with the first political prisoner that I represented, and that was Anatoly Sharansky. Sharansky was imprisoned for, among other things, becoming a founder of the Helsinki human rights monitoring groups in the former Soviet Union, where even though the Soviet Union had signed the Helsinki Agreement, but for them this was anti-Soviet slander and agitation. And he was sentenced to 13 years imprisonment for sedition, et cetera, et cetera. In 1984, or let me just put it, Gorbachev became the president of the Soviet Union in 1985. And Sharansky was released within 6 months of him becoming president. And I happened to have been on a panel with him sometime after that, and I put the question to him. I said, did you have anything to do with Sharansky's release? I said, I noted he was released after 8.5 years in prison, some 6 months after you became president. He said, well, you may not believe this, but when I was secretary or Minister of Agriculture in former Soviet, I had never heard of Sharansky. I know he was a household word. I had never heard of him. I came to Canada in 1984. I appeared before your Canadian Parliamentary Committee on Agriculture. He said, well, after a few questions on agriculture, they started to ask me about this guy, Sharansky. Then I left the Parliament buildings. There was a big demonstration for this guy, Sharansky. I was then hosted by your Minister of Agriculture, Eugene Whalen, kept asking me questions about this guy, Sharansky. So when I became president of the Soviet Union a year later, I ordered up his file. He said, and I looked, he said, yes, he was a troublemaker, but he wasn't a criminal. And then he said the most important thing. He said, but his case was costing us. It was costing us politically. It was costing us economically. It was costing us in terms of our image. So I ordered his release in our self-interest. I happen to think that Homa Hoodfar's case is very similar because you had a mobilization of advocacy on her behalf, scientists, academics, etc. And this internationalization of advocacy also came at a time when I believe Iran, number one, was worried that they might have another Kazemi case on their hands, and two, they were imprisoning dual nationals, and I think they wanted to get the spotlight somewhat away. Homa Hoodfar was a dual national. I think that was part of the randomness of her imprisonment, but what we may not appreciate is after she was released, some of the leading human rights activists in Iran were sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, like Muhammadi. But this was obscured by the understandable and welcome release of Homa Hoodfar. But I believe her release came about only because of the combination of effective public advocacy and effective private diplomacy. And that brought it about, let alone her own personal moral courage.
Right. And Dr. Hoodfar, to what extent were you aware of any of the efforts that were going on? And ultimately, why did you think that you were released when the time came?
Well, I actually was not aware because I didn't have any contact with outside world. But I occasionally, from the kind of question they would come and ask me, I would know that something is happening. Otherwise, they wouldn't ask me. For instance, they would suddenly ask about one of my colleagues or some program or something. Then I knew, obviously, something is happening because otherwise they wouldn't be asking. But in terms of, I think they were very concerned about the Zahra Kazemi's case because although a lot of people have complained that Canada didn't do very much, but the fact that the case has been both by civil society but also by Canadian government have been mentioned a lot and have been court cases on that, it has kept the case alive. So they were very concerned about not having another Zahra Kazemi, especially when I got very sick and they had to take me to hospital. That was one thing. And they would continuously, even though obviously they were the interrogator, they're asking me questions, but they would say, have you experienced physical torture? Have you experienced torture? And I would say, well, physical torture, no, but of course there are psychological torture there. So they asked me this also as they were filming me, so that I could say to the camera that there was no physical torture in case I come out and change my story. So that was interesting. So the public advocacy had a lot to do with the way with my release, and I think it was very important. There were letters from scholarly communities, not from just Canada, but from a whole range of places, including a lot of countries from the Muslim context. So that was kind of strange for them that this was organized. The other factor was that so many letters had gone from the public. I know that from Amnesty International, 42,000 letters had gone to the Office of Supreme Leader. Usually President's office gets more because most people don't know that in Iran you have to write to both authorities, the elected and non-elected authorities. So it's a bit of a complex state situation. So I think public advocacy and of course the Canadian government did a lot behind the scenes because there was no direct relationship. They also used Oman as a country in the region. So a lot of the negotiation took place through Oman, but I had no idea. All I know that I was a prisoner in morning of the 26th of September, and by the afternoon I was the royal guest of Oman. So, and a few days later, after I had some treatment and met with the physicians, then they allowed me to fly back to Montreal.
And Irwin Cotler, you mentioned that double-barrel approach where you've got the pressure from the outside groups and the public groups, but also potentially back-channel communication behind the scenes. How do they work together, and is there a risk of them stepping on each other? How does that have to be coordinated? How sophisticated is that process?
Well, if it can be coordinated, it can be more effective, because then you can at least be working on the same playing field and the same wavelength. What is important, though, is that both exist and both are aware of each other. And as I say, if they can be coordinated, all the better. I think you're witnessing some of that now in the case of the imprisoned Saudi blogger Raif Badawi, because there is an increasing public awareness and internationalization of his case and cause. As we're meeting today, it's just been announced that the Liberal Internationals are now awarding him their International Human Rights Award. And Foreign Minister Stéphane Dion, in going to Saudi Arabia, and then when a Saudi Arabian representation was here last week, not only raised the case, but made public mention of the fact that he was raising the case. So the two in tandem, I think, can bring about a situation where I'm hoping that Saudi Arabia will realize if they don't want to release him for justice reasons or for humanitarian reasons, that it's in their self-interest to do so. Because otherwise they're going to bump into protests at the European Parliament. There's going to be protests, and as Homa said, and it's coming also from some Muslim countries and sources. There's going to be legal representations that they'll have to answer to at the international arena. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has already declared his detention to be illegal and called for his release, et cetera, et cetera. So this critical mass of the internationalization of advocacy on the one hand, and the effective private diplomacy, not only from Dion, but we are hoping will be proceeding from the US, from European countries and the like. And I know as we meet right now, the Germans are making representation. So the convergence of this, I hope, will secure his release.
Now, I want to mention that we'd like to open the microphone up to people in the audience. I'm sure people have many questions, around this theme. We've got a microphone set up there, and I think one there too. So we'll give you a chance to come to the microphone if you have questions. In the meantime, as I give people that opportunity, Viviana Fernandez, I wanted to come back to you now. And of course, we've heard about the situation in Iran, and there's a long history of this kind of detainment in Iran, and of course the historic examples from the Soviet Union. But there are new areas of concern as well, and I know you are, tracking the situation, the recent situation, kind of an alarming situation in Turkey. There's also Egypt, other areas. So can you give us a sense of what are the growing areas of concern and what is happening there?
Yeah, in particular, those two countries are interesting examples in the negative sense. But something that needs to be said is that academic freedom and independence of inquiry are in the constitution of both those countries. And in spite of that, you have had a spike in violence and arrests, prosecutions, travel restrictions, and loss of position for thousands of scholars and students. So in that regard, the situation in Turkey in particular not only started at the beginning of the year from a petition that was signed by 1,200 or so scholars and to the government, and that ensued some repercussions, serious repercussions to those 1,100 scholars. And after the failed attempted coup of July this year, the violence escalated even further, and within the first 10 days following the coup, you had 1,500 deans who had been asked to resign, and a ban of all work-related travel, and actually the obligation for Turkish scholars who were abroad at the time to return immediately to Turkey. Very hard to imagine how they thought this could be enforced, but they imposed that condition nevertheless.
And I just want to jump on that, and I want to hear more too, but what do you think the Turkish government was trying to accomplish? As you say, it seems almost unrealistic to somehow have all the Turkish scholars around the world be flying back to Turkey all of a sudden at this moment of instability. What's the reasoning there?
It is hard to decouple the politics of it and the pure international landscape they were operating under, from the measures against what they perceived to be an attack to their sovereign responsibility to manage the affairs of the country, in particular to the situation of Kurdish rebels in the south of Turkey, which is what caused the whole problem to begin with. But what I would like to note is that in doing that, they're not really taking into account the negative consequences that this has brought up to the Turkish higher education sector. So not only they have become not reliable partners for research, for teaching and student exchanges, to host conferences. So they have really tarnished their reputation in proceeding with this harsh crackdown. And if we look further down the line, you can see an impact in economic and innovation prospects for the country, because they have become an isolated environment.
You know, there's one more thing I want to ask you, which is about this kind of broad definition of scholars at risk. We're talking about places where, maybe as Westerners, we kind of imagine, okay, there's instability there. There are more authoritarian type governments there, even if they're, even if they are democracies, they have more of an authoritarian stance. But the idea of a scholar at risk is not just restricted to that part of the world. There are scholars at risk in Western societies as well. And I wonder if you could give me a sense of what that would mean.
I think the scope of instability and of insecurity in higher academic educational institutions is widespread. So geographically, as I mentioned, you have people with guns in university campuses right south of the border. So it doesn't take much to think that professors who are teaching in their class and get a request from a student who doesn't like the mark they received may have a gun, and you are with them alone in your office. So what does that do to somebody who needs to be impartial, to teach on a weekly basis, see that person who he knows may be carrying a gun? So it is really not a situation that can be pinpointed to a geographical region of the world, unfortunately. And the types of situations we're seeing vary greatly. And one aspect that I would like to underscore is that it's not only the thought leaders who are at risk, but also the students who may be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
We have a question, so thanks for standing by.
No problem. My name is Chuck Black. I'm a writer, actually. I mostly write about the aerospace industry in Canada and the United States. And I think the panelists have done a really good description of what happens internationally when an academic is restricted or imprisoned. But I'd like you to tell me a little bit more about the domestic reaction. I think your last response talks a little bit about what happens domestically when an academic is imprisoned in Iran. But I'd like you to go into it a little bit more. That seems to me to be the core of why a national government would imprison an academic, not so much because the academic has done something bad by themselves, but because of the effect they think the imprisonment will have in others. Does that make sense?
Is it to me?
Yeah, you can start. I'm talking about
Yes.
how do they promote the imprisonment in their media domestically? What's the reaction on the local professors and the academic community? You spoke about it a little bit, but I think that goes to the core to why national governments do this sort of thing.
In the case, you have the gamut really, where it is really done to individuals in particular. So the case of Dr. Hoodfar is one of them. And then you have massive cases like in Egypt and Turkey, where you have thousands of people imprisoned for years without charges. And so what that does to the environment in which scholars operate I would imagine is quite of a chilling effect. And in terms of the areas of inquiry they will decide to pursue and the type of publications or invitations they will accept, I would say that that would have a negative effect. And so what comes after is really deterioration, a very rapid deterioration of the variety of research that is done and the richness of exchanges that you can see because people are operating under fear. So in Egypt, for example, you also have situations where the government has started to curtail visitors. So scholars apply to go or to spend some time in certain institutions and they get denied their visas or they get rejected at the border for justified reasons according to them. You have people who have been imprisoned for attending conferences abroad. So even their actions abroad can bring some level of risk when they come back. So what does to the people trying to conduct their normal scholarly work, I think it could be quite impactful.
So you're saying it's either a contributor, the first step in the deterioration of the academic community and the academic freedom in the area where it happens?
Well, absolutely. If you have people in certain countries who are actually not participating in the exchanges anymore, or for an extended period of time, and then the difficulty for them to re-engage in the scientific debate after having been precluded from participating would be almost impossible to catch up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have another question.
Sure, and my name is Lee Fleur, and I'm with Science Fair Media. Dr. Hoodfar, I'm just wondering if you can give me a better sense or give us a better sense about how you're taking the underlying sociology that you experienced in this jail and how that's going to be helping inform your future research, being a woman dealing with politics in Arab countries and countries of the like.
Well, one way that I actually managed to survive this, especially when I was in this tiny cell in Irwin prison, was that I actually took it as a research. So on the third day of my interrogation, I was so exhausted, I decided, okay, I'm an anthropologist, I'm here, and it's not a field work I would have liked to do. Participant observation, after all, is the main method of anthropologists. So
Imagine writing the grant proposal.
So I started making notes, but I had no pen and paper, so as I said, I had a toothbrush. That was the only item that I had, so I started just writing on the wall with my toothbrush, which after when I had one other woman is staying in the tiny cell with me, said, why are you doing that? I said, so I'm writing. He said, what kind of writing? You can't take it? I said, well, this is just help me to think and help me to remember. And she thought I was crazy, just like she said, I knew professors are always crazy, but you are really crazy. But that's the way I actually handled the situation. But of course, psychologically, if it's not an easy thing to do. So, but I want to continue on that. I mean, for me I said, okay, I had accepted that I have at least 5 to 10 years in Irwin prison, so I have to somehow make the best of it. So that's the way I dealt with it. But in terms of my other colleagues in Iran, that have been, some of them have been taken in for 2 weeks or 1 month, or some people 5 or 6 years, just because they wrote a book on some social problem, not even on the theoretical issues, but on the political issues. But they have been, so they choose very benign topics, or a lot of people do research and they write, but they never publish it. It's like sits in their drawers in the hope that one day they can publish it. But so that's the impact that this kind of arrest has on the research community especially, or even subjects of what books they can choose to teach. my colleagues in Iran, but also in Egypt, they are very concerned about what topics is their lectures, what books they can assign to students. So those are all the impact that this kind of arrest has on people. It's not just the time you spend in jail, but it's also what you do afterwards. I mean, okay, I have come out, I have come to Canada, it's very different. So I always said I was going to finish my 3 books and then maybe start traveling a little bit. Now I have 4 books to write. Right, and what I named my research as I was there, I said I do anthropology of interrogation. So 45 sessions of my interrogation plus talking to another 15 women who in a different time they brought them to share my cell with me, and then they would move them and bring somebody else. And that helped me to actually collect the data on that. So that kind of, once I took it as a research, but if I was going to live in Iran, then it would have been very different, had a different consequence for my subsequent research.
And if I may, I'm curious to know, you talk about the period after being released from jail. I'm just wondering if you can give me a better sense of how you're dealing with the emotional and psychological torture that you're endured there, and how you might be able to use that to help other people that Professor Fernandez is working with, and Professor Cotler, of academics being imprisoned.
Well, for my case, I think to come back and become aware of enormous support and mobilization that was done to release me, that I think has gone a long way to help me to adjust to the situation, but also the fact that I treated this as a research period, compulsory research period, but it was a research period, has been easy. Physically, it has not been easy, although I do my best, but physical situation at my age is not quite easy to recover, but I'm hoping in a few months will be good. But the other thing, I'm hoping to use this opportunity, now that I have an experience actually working on the scholars, for scholars of this, but also working with like Nargis Mohammadi, who was actually jailed for 16 years for being a woman activist inside Iran, and for other people who are not necessarily dual national. I mean, we often forget when we do the campaign for dual national that there are also national people who have nowhere else to go. And also it's very difficult for people in Iran mobilize for their support, because people in Iran, then they themselves would be subject to imprisonment and detainment. So places like Iran or Saudi Arabia, it's very important that these cases to be then widespread outside and put pressure from outside on these states to release scholars or other human rights activists. So that's, I hope that I can invest some of my time working on those issues.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question, and there is one more question. No, that's
Thanks.
you.
All right. Hi, my name is Anne Go. I'm a chemist by training, but have been interested and involved in science policy for several years. So public advocacy and private diplomacy to release a scholar who is imprisoned can be very effective. I'm wondering if any of the panelists can comment on what can be done to prevent a culture against academic freedom from taking root. I don't know if that's a question that can be answered. That's kind of like what can be done to prevent authoritarian governments from taking root. But Dr. Hoodfar, you'd mentioned at some point explaining the concept of academic freedom to your interrogators. So are there kind of recommendations that our panelists could give to us that could kind of put us along a path of maybe it's taking the time to talk to somebody who doesn't understand your point of view or something? How can we counter kind of a polarization and cultures where, or attitudes where the where thinking independently is seen as such a threat to the state that it should be suppressed? Like, are there kind of little steps that ordinary citizens can do to keep it alive and to stop that from happening in their own countries?
Do you mean as we, like us as Canada, or we as Canadians, trying to reinforce those ideas elsewhere, or within our own culture?
People within
Or
countries.
people within their culture?
Yeah, but since some of our panelists have international perspectives, I mean, if there are things that can be done within individual countries, I understand it's different in different countries, so I don't know. Maybe start with Canadians.
Are there kind of sets of principles? Are there ways of promoting this idea that are effective?
Well, I actually have been thinking a lot about this. I think it's very, as I mentioned before, I think it's very important for us to actually make academic freedom an important step for society as a public discourse, and not just right for ourselves or for the state, but for general public. And that was one of the points that I was mentioning before. I mean, in the 1940s, especially after the Second World War, Polanyi and a lot of other people actually organized, formed societies to discuss the importance of academic freedom, write on that in journals. And I think it's very important to, the articles written, for instance, articles that are written here in Canada or elsewhere, we can translate them, have them in various languages, especially for the countries that the state is very repressive. And make this available in the local languages so that it can be part of the newspaper. People, especially now, if digital technology is there and the state use it, we can use it this way too, to spread this idea. The difference between the idea that I mentioned, the difference between a novelist being arrested and a scientist being arrested in the public opinion is a lot. Everybody will talk about the novelist who has been arrested because of their work, but how many people would talk about a scientist who has been arrested? Very few people, maybe at the universities, but it's not a general public. Therefore, the pressure on the state internally is actually very little. Even repressive states like Iran do show reaction to public opinion. It's not as they just rely on repression. They still need legitimacy of being supported by some segment of society. So I think that's important. But I'm sure there are many other ways if we put our mind into it. It's very important. But I myself, for instance, the only time I actually read anything about academic freedom is when I was a graduate student. That's many decades ago. So I think we should make that more part of the both university culture, but also general popular culture.
You know, and as we wrap up, we've got a room full of science policy people here, perhaps some people who are really thinking about this for the first time. So Irwin, Cotler, Viviana, Fernandez, if there are people who want to become more involved or think about ways to be more engaged, or what next steps can be, what do you suggest? Where do we go from here?
I would invite people in Canada and academic institutions especially to join, in particular, the Scholars at Risk network, and to support the work in terms of identifying incidents and reporting those attacks against the higher academic communities, students, staff members, and professors. And just to mention that so far there are only 15 academic institutions who are members of the network, most of them in Ontario, and together they are hosting 5 scholars at risk, people who have fled their countries and who have found only temporarily relief in Canadian campuses to hopefully be able to take back a little bit of the lost time through their ordeal. So I think there is a lot of room for contributions and for involvement citizenship advocacy through social media is also becoming more of the norm, and we see it in contexts such as bullying and you know, when you have attacks, terrorist attacks, and police misconduct and so forth. So issues of academic freedom could become also something that you are aware of, top of mind, and if you see something, you say something, you report it. So that can also contribute.
Closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think that there are different contexts and sort of different geopolitical, cultural contexts that may help implement or, and the reverse, deter. So you have to have an appreciation of the geopolitical, cultural context. For example, take the two cases of Turkey and Egypt. You have a situation here where Turkey is a NATO country, it's an Islamic democracy, it's part of the coalition against ISIS, and so there's a reluctance by Western governments to go ahead and take up the cudgels against Turkey, and Turkey gets, in a sense, a free pass to continue their repression because of the geopolitical context. Some of that is similar with respect to Egypt. In other words, better to have them than the radical Islamists that might replace them if we somehow destabilize them. So there's that delicate balance there. But I think that NATO countries, for example, should be speaking up more with respect to Turkey, a fellow NATO country, at a time that you have a massive crackdown in Turkey. Number one. The second thing is, I think it's, and I found this useful, is to take the legal system of the imprisoning country seriously. For example, when I was representing Professor Saad ad-Din Ibrahim in Egypt, an Egyptian academic, and I was appearing before the Cour de Cassation, the appellate court in Egypt, I based my legal brief entirely on Egyptian law. Most of these repressive regimes actually have very good constitutions and good codes of procedure. They just don't follow them. They violate them. But when I went before the court, I said that I took their system seriously. I wasn't saying they were violating Canadian law. They were violating their own law. And I found that that helped in terms of maybe securing his release. And similarly, with regard to Iran, one makes the case also on the fact that Iran takes Islamic law seriously. So make the case on the basis of Islamic law. Third is a case like Venezuela, because Venezuela is, for all intents and purposes, a democracy, but it's a democracy that's imprisoning, dissidents. And in fact, the leader of the Democratic opposition, Leopoldo Lopez, has been imprisoned. So here too, we're using a variety of means. Representation to the Organization of American States, working in common cause with civil society in Venezuela, developing legal briefs on the basis of Venezuelan society. And the final thing is, I think that, and here Iran is a good example, at least I found it, to try to make the case to them that repression is not in their interest. In other words, imprisoning Ahoda Hoodfar, they don't need another Kazemi case. And that our representations are not against Iran, they're pro-Iran. They're pro-human rights. They're pro-civil society and the like. So they don't feel that there's a threat to regime change, but the case is made to them, to the regime, it's in your self-interest not to imprison, and to civil society that we are with you.
Right. Like so many things in policy, in all aspects of policy, think win-win. In a sense, to try to make progress. Irwin, Cotler, I really want to thank you for your perspectives, and also Viviana, Fernandez. Thank you, both of you, for sharing your expert ideas. And of course, especially I want to thank Dr. Homa Hoodfar. It has been fantastic to have you. We're delighted to have you here with us in person, and we are especially honored to have you be able to speak to us freely and to talk to us about these important experiences. Thank you very much. Please join me in thank you.